Good morning, Mr. Raja Wise, Captain D.K. Singh, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I'm floored by the very gracious words spoken about me by Captain D.K. Singh. Most of it's perhaps uncalled for, but be that as it may, I accept that with utmost humility. I'm delighted to be here amidst all of you this morning. For one, the theme resonates very dearly with me in terms of my exposure first-hand to the maritime sector, which straddles about 6 years plus, which is also another occasion for us to interface on a physical level after 2 horrendous years that have gone by. I'm glad that you have turned out in fairly large numbers. Let me just share with you some insights which I want to sort of present in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So please bear with me in the course of that. In the 6 years that I spent very intimately in 2 assignments back to back, initially as Second in Command, Joint Director General of Shipping from 2011 to 2014, and then on a consecutive basis as Director General of Shipping for the next 2 years, going right up to the end of 2016 before I superannuated in the rank of Secretary in the Government of India. My general sense, and pardon me for being a contrarian here, and I don't mean to, ruffle any feathers, so to speak, is that we've all been cottoned and in a very cocooned manner in what we perceive to be, the brand value of Indian maritime education. I'm not trying to run it down. And please don't mistake me that, post-retirement, one could have the luxury of, bashing. It's not so at all. But when I look back in retrospect, while the basic core of Indian maritime education has served the interests of the Indian maritime sector in a very yeoman way, to a very large extent, my instinctive sense is that we need to go beyond the status quo. Often we sort of position ourselves and say that, we have been in conformity with the STCW convention of the IMO. That's of 2010 vintage, honestly speaking. Now there is conversation around, there's a narrative around the fact that you need to have another iteration of that. It is just as well, it's 12 years down the line. We also, are very proud to proclaim that we have gone beyond the STCW and, for instance, in our DNS program, which, straddles for about 18 months, unlike the bare minimum prescribed of 12 months in the STCW convention. So be it. But the fact is that there are several trend lines which are emerging, more importantly across the globe, very discernible, very, very perceptible, and I think we'll be foolhardy in not recognizing all that is lying ahead of the maritime sector. These are challenges, and yet at the same time they bear potential for opportunities for us to leverage. Now let's try and look at some of this. If I go back in time, there is this overt obsession, pardon me again, I'm not being hypercritical just because I'm no more in the government, but I mean well, and I mean very dearly for this cause. We have generally been obsessed with the technicalities of maritime education. We have been led to believe that it is all about the 3 broad domains: the naval architecture, the nautical, and the marine engineering. I mean, I completely understand that is indeed the tripod or the 3 pillars of maritime education, for sure. But a time has come when we need to look beyond. If you sort of visualize the paradigm of the maritime industry per se, the way it is evolving, and I quite foresee in the next 15-20 years time horizon, it's a no-brainer that it is just not enough to have good enough to have technical skills alone. It is for certain that if you got to be a good mariner, you need to have those core competencies. There is no getting away from that fact. But the maritime industry is becoming complex. I mean, as is the case with any other sector, for instance. It's leading to a maturation where you need to build in other elements. For example, the commercial elements, the financial elements, the legal aspects of this. So, if you want to be a mariner in a very rounded and a grounded manner, I think it is just about time that you looked at sort of dovetailing all of these pieces and putting it across into a whole. We have said one of the critical elements which I keep harping is that, and I say it with utmost humility, there was enormous pressure in my time in the 6 years that I spent, not too long ago from 2011 to 2016, to open up maritime education in terms of having more institutions and the like. But again, very deferentially, I beg to differ at that point of time. I said no. When you look back in the year 1998, when maritime education was liberalized, opened up to the private sector, the floodgates were opened up, literally speaking. You had n number of institutions which came about. It served the interests of the sector at that point in time because there was a growing demand, the industry was booming, and everybody was wanting to ride the crest, so to speak. But you must look to times which are ahead. Remember that maritime industry, as is the case with any other sector, is cyclical in nature. It's completely foolhardy to assume that all is well when everything is hunky-dory, and this is now the next 5 years is going to be the most glorious time ever in our life. Far from it. There is always a downside to that. So let's foresee that and build scenarios for that purpose. And sure enough, what really happened was that the chickens came home to roost. Come 2008, when there was a global financial sector meltdown, the industry went into a tailspin, not for any reason of its making, but it was collateral damage of all that happened around the globe. Nobody foresaw that coming. Now what happened is, when you kept the tap open, so to speak, you had mushrooming of institutions, a very large capacity that was created in terms of intake, but nobody foresaw that you need to provide training slots, for God's sake. A mariner doesn't get completed, he or she doesn't finish their time unless they do sea time. The structured shipboard training program. You don't go to sea, how on earth are you going to complete let alone get employed? So nobody provision for that. So there was this mindless opening up of the sector, and I'm not wanting to cast any aspersions or, and say that somebody prior to me was responsible for that. But I think we need to be responsible and ensure that when we open up the education sector, we need to do in a very calibrated and a nuanced manner. Which is to say that you provide for as many training slots or a capacity in an institution as there are slots on board ships across the globe, whether it's of national tonnage or it's an international fleet. And so when I came in 2011, there was this mad scramble that please open up the sector. I mean, it took us enormous effort, and when I look back, and to say no to the powers that be. They said, no, for God's sake, please close the tap. It's pouring, it's leaking. And this is not an exaggeration. Please go back in time. There is state statistics data which is well borne out that there were 5,000 to 10,000 boys and girls who were out in the streets in a limbo, not knowing what in hell they need to do because they were not getting slots to complete, either the 6 months in the case of marine engineering or 18 months in the case of the DNS cadets, or even the 6 months for the BSc nautical boys and girls. So the point I want to say is that, I don't want to labor it any further, that the capacity building has to be in consonance with the ability of the industry to absorb as many cadets or trainees as it can, realistically speaking. So that one has to be conscious and mindful of at all points of time. You're doing great disservice to those boys and girls by enticing and luring them, as it were, and saying that I will offer you the moon in the maritime industry. For God's sake, let's get off our high horse. Don't hold up rosy dreams if they don't finish. So that's the point I want to make. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when you look at the overall scheme of maritime education, there is also this near obsession, to go about having two aspects. One is you have, the trading and training ships, so to speak, right? And then you also have shipping campus. I'm not arguing against it. The shipping campus was as close a substitute as you could get to sea time. So if you couldn't send boys and girls in terms of adequate capacity, then clearly this was the next best thing that you could offer in terms of shipping campus. Then there was this other, this great fanciful idea that you can have training ships and the like. It was bandied about at the time that I was DG. I might sound contrarian, no disrespect meant, but this is the harsh, bitter reality. When I did a quick research, training ships, pardon me if I'm ignorant, so please feel free to interrupt. My experience proved that training ships were an absolute disaster world over in the maritime industry. Japan tried it, Korea tried it, a few other maritime advanced nations did try it, but none of them succeeded. There was this bizarre formulation which came about, and I don't want to take any names, well meant, with the best of intentions, but not rooted in reality. That you position one maritime ship in the west coast, one on the east coast, anchor it on the coastline, and have boys and girls getting trained, and let that be visible to the stakeholders, for it as a showcase that, there is maritime education happening. But when I looked at it, I told some of the policy makers, I said, for God's sake, what are you trying to make out of it? I'm not a mariner by profession, I'm a civil servant. But I have no hesitation in matters of policy formulation in telling you the pros and the cons. At my level, I would be failing in my duty if I didn't give you a balance sheet of the credits and the debits of any proposal. Then it is left to the powers that be higher in rank than me to take that call. But I would fail singularly if I didn't do that. So I said, look, if you want to do that, you anchoring a ship, look at the cost of that. A ballpark figure is anywhere from 5 to 10 lakhs per day, per vessel, just a stationary ship. Okay. And then I said, fundamentally, please, you're not recognizing that STCW wants the boys and the girls to be trained, including in cargo operations. I said, how on earth is cargo operation going to happen if a vessel is anchored along the coastline, is doing zilch cargo, not handling any cargo? You're not meeting the requirements of the STCW. And then I said, this is something which should have occurred to, as a no-brainer to somebody who spent a lifetime in the merchant navy, that when you go to a bridge, how many people can you train at a point in time? Okay, if you go to the engine room, 8, 10 persons of 10, 15 trainees at the most, at any given point of time, multiply it by number of batches that you can do in a day. 50? What impact is it going to make on the longest cycle? You are having thousands of trainees. How is it realistically going to be possible for you to ever finish without any sea time? There is no exposure to cargo. I said, you're looking at something which is an absolute unrealistic proposition. I was criticized, hyper-criticized I said, no, I stood my ground and I said, look, this is my perception. I'm not a mariner, but the way I look at it is that this is a disaster in making. This is a surefire recipe for disaster. The cost of capital, the capex and the opex on this is disproportionate to the benefits that is going to accrue to you. So it is about time that we busted this myth that trading ships are the panacea. Unless You then transcend into the real world of having a training come trading ship. Then it makes sense. You're traversing the seas, you're exposing the boys and the girls, they do cargo operations and then they do it. But where is the berth? Where is the capacity for, putting them up? Most companies are not willing to have those berths. So just to put things in perspective as to what the challenge is like, but I'll come to some more interesting nuggets, so to speak. I think when you look at maritime education, as I said, you need to transcend beyond the realm of the pure play technicalities. No disrespect meant, not just nautical, not merely engineering, not merely naval architecture. Critical, for sure, absolutely there is no getting away from that, but you have to have something plus or beyond that, which means that you need to have exposure to commercials, financials, insurance, and the bigger picture in the world. Then you may argue and say, come back to me and say, why expose all of this right at the beginning of a career? But please, the way I see it is that these boys and girls will have at best what, 10, 15 years at sea? Today the average time, unlike in the previous generations where people spend 30 years or even more, sailing. Today the average lifespan is not more than 12 to 15 years max. Am I right? So you have to provision for an alternate career somewhere right at the beginning. So you need to train them in those skill sets. So when you start looking at that, how many of our maritime training, and please no offense meant to anybody here at all, how many of our maritime training institutions gear their boys and girls, and I'm being gender neutral here, in trying to, present to them some of these elements? Let's look at this, for example. How many of them are encouraging them to, have the orientation towards research and development, R&D? R&D is one of the key parameters under which most industries have flourished. Why do the Europeans and from the North American continent dominate the proceedings in the IMO? If somebody attends, and I had the privilege of being there from 2011 to 2016, 5 consecutive years, when you attend the meetings of the International Maritime Organization, you feel that literally the European continent is breathing down your neck in terms of their technology, their processes. That's because you may not like it, but at the end of the day, those guys have spent billions of euros, done tons of research, come up with superlative products, which they are able to influence the thinking in the IMO and have it brought into a standards, technical standards. How many of us even look at that? We couldn't care a damn for research and development. Research and development is easier said than done. It's not anybody's game, nor is it an overnight formulation. It takes years, but somewhere somebody has to start thinking collectively. I'm sure it's not easy to do it individually. That do we start looking at a research and development orientation where our boys and girls are trained, not necessarily into the sea career, but okay, start becoming professional R&D scientists. Then you set up some lab. The ecosystem today for startups is probably the best in our lifetime. You look at startups across sectors and segments in India. It's very amenable. So do we capitalize and leverage that opportunity? How many of us infuse that in our boys and girls? We will have none of that really, because we are blinkered. We will just go exactly the way we were trained and nothing more, nothing less. That's it. We will not destabilize the status quo. How many of us have ever thought of, bandying about a think tank? You look at the Western nations, the maritime powers, they all conceptualize, ideate, come up with brilliant ideas, and say, okay, and that feeds into policy making. There is a synergy, there is a symbiotic relationship between the think tanks, R&D centers and the industry. That's how the industry evolves and grows and matures over a period of time. But none of us will have it. We don't even have one single think tank worth the name anywhere across the Indian landscape. Correct me if I'm wrong. So unless you have this, so that's another orientation which, I would prefer that. How do you look at it? How many of us train our cadets and trainees to look at, for example, what is the technology that is emerging 10, 15, 20 years? The semi-automation, the automated ships completely, unmanned ships. This is not a bogey that you can keep it aside. That's a reality which is emerging, whether we like it or not. In 15 years, 20 years time horizon, I don't know, within our lifetime, certainly in the lifetime of the younger generation here, you will see semi-autonomous ships coming into play. 20, 40 years from now, you will have autonomous ships. When you are training a cadet or a trainee today, if you are looking at if they are around early 20s, clearly they will have 2 to 3 decades ahead. So do we provision for that and say, okay, what happens in that landscape? The entire, seafaring will probably alter by that time. Do we provision for that? What happens? Today we are the 5th largest manpower supplying nation in the maritime sector. We pride ourselves and say we want to have a 15% share. We are about 9 to 10% already. But what happens when there is a decline? Do we then look at an alternate career when on shore, like drones, for example? Today drones are commanded remotely. So that's an alternate career that you can look at when the command and control structures and processes are all driven, completely automated out of a remote location. Do we train our trainees and cadets to see that that could be a potential scenario? So let's start looking at that from now. How many of us even dare to talk about logistics, supply and chain management issues in the maritime training institutions? There is an intimate connect between the two. There is no getting away from the fact. Your EXIM trade that you move through the maritime or the sea routes is directly proportional to the kind of logistics supply chain industry that you will have. If anything, the pandemic has driven home tellingly of what havoc supply chain disruptions can do to the maritime industry if you look back only the last 2 years. The fact that you were not able to get off your seafarers, sign them off, sign on another set, port operations were jeopardized, completely undermined, and the ripple effect that it had on trading. Do we ever tell our boys and girls, look, I'm not advocating that you infuse all of this top heavy into the curriculum, but I'm saying that time has come when you start needing to look at building small modules in the curriculum and the syllabi of the maritime training institutions so that they think beyond and that they say, okay, let's look at this. This is a trend line which is very discernible, perceptible. I must start looking at this from now on. How many of us encourage or even perhaps are aware that public policy making has now undergone a paradigm shift? I remember in my lifetime, I joined the civil service in the year 1980. 80 was a good, it's like a fossilized era of 1980 when I look back in time. It was a highly regulated governance structure. You dare not even ask the government, a citizen couldn't even dare ask a government what the hell you were doing for us at that time. Everything was close-knit. Whatever the civil servant of the day condescended and decided to tell you or give you, that was it to it, because it was highly feudalistic. But signs of time, 91 came the liberalization, privatization, globalization. Gradually policy making sort of eased up. 2013 was towards virtually the end of my civil service career, was a watershed year. There was a mandate issued by the cabinet, the union cabinet, through the law ministry that willy-nilly every public policy document will have to be drafted in consultation with all stakeholders. The draft of that policy will have to be put out in the public domain in the website of the respective administration. In the case of the Maritime Administration, it is the Office of the Director General of Shipping. And inputs and feedback was solicited. It was welcome for a good 30 days or even beyond if it was extended. So, do we encourage? How many maritime training institutions even know that here is an opportunity where you can, use the collective wisdom of boys and girls and the faculty to look at the websites of the DG Shipping, the Ministry of Shipping, whenever there's a policy document, to contribute, at least start thinking. That policy is going to impact you, for God's sake. That policy is not in isolation, that is meant for the maritime industry, and you boys and girls are going to be jolly well a part of it sooner than later. So if you have an opportunity coming your way where the government is saying, please feel free to get back, it's nobody's case that every feedback will be accepted. I remember when 2015 as Director General of Shipping, I was asked to draft a new Admiralty Bill for the first time. The last Admiralty Bill was in 1831 to 1890. I mean, it was as far back as that. It was a different matter that in 1992 in MV Elizabeth versus others, the Supreme Court in a land bank judgment said that the Admiralty regime of the country is hopelessly antediluvian. It is a good 130 years plus, and that it must be revised. Nothing happened. I remember Mr. Gadkari told me in 2015 Jan, he said, Shetty sahab, aapko ye Admiralty Bill ek saal mein karke karna hai. I said, fine sir, I'll do it. So we went about it. It was painful because we had to spend 3 to 4 hours every day amidst all other commitments, sit through, consult the industry, but it was worth it. It was a very productive exercise. And we were able to draft, we put out the draft, we called in everybody, did a very inclusive consultative process, took everybody on board, put out the draft in the public domain on the website of the DG's office, kept it for 75 days, got a whole lot of feedback into it, then again go through the motions of having another round of consultation where we finalized. But the interesting catch to this is the policy document of the government says it is not enough for you to reject a feedback or an input. You must, when you refer that policy to the ministry and when it finally culminates in the draft cabinet note, the DCN, it is the onus of the head of the department of that organization to tell why you disagreed with an input. So you need to prepare a PERT chart and say where you agreed, for what reason, where you differed, what is the reason, because that was supposed to be transparent. And it was left to the secretary and the minister of the administrative ministry and then the cabinet secretary and the secretary to the prime minister to examine and know, to sort of identify whether it was justified. So that is the sense of accountability. So to fast forward, to come back to what I said, look at some of this. Public policy draft available to you. Please encourage the boys and girls to start looking at it. Some of it may be very alien. Some of it may just go over their heads because it's, they're not used to it. But this is where the faculty must encourage them to start thinking that because this is going to have an impact on you. How many of us really talk ever in a maritime training course about Sagar Mala, Bharat Mala, ever? These are paradigm changes. Slow to get off the ground for sure, but it's happening. We are getting somewhere there. Again, deeply connected to the way maritime industry is going to be looked at. There is this national logistics policy, as is the case with anything else. There is a blue economy policy, for God's sake. Blue economy is the next big thing that's going to happen. We have a 3.2 million square kilometers of exclusive economic zone in the country. 3.2 million. And in terms of UNCLOS, United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas of 1982, that 3.2 million square kilometers is exclusively India's sovereign domain. So whatever resources are embedded in the sea and in the sub-sea is for India to tap. The government has recognized that, it holds the potential, the key to a great deal of prosperity in the future. Maritime industry is going to play a crucial role because you need to get things out, position, deploy DP vessels and whatever have you. That's another great opportunity, the blue economy. Start encouraging them to look at blue economy, the national logistic policy. Sporadically, we have talked about, the extent of automation, digitization, electronization, mechanization that's coming about in industry. enabled services, ITES, information communication technology, ICT, artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, and the whole slew of that. All of that is happening as we speak. And whether we like it or not, that is going to impact the fortunes of the maritime industry going forward. So let's encourage some of our youngsters to, look at that. There is a humongous policy initiative which I'm particularly excited about, provided it pans out well, is the Unified Logistics Interface Platform, just announced about 2 months ago by the Government of India, the Department of Commerce, the Logistics Division, which is, if all goes well, if things play out as it is designed to be, across the board, starting from Reserve Bank, all the banks, financial institutions, ports, all the logistics supply chain players, the maritime industry guys, all regulatory agencies will all come on board this one single electronic platform, all communications, messaging. You have, for example, the port community system today, the PCS as we understand, PCS 1.0, today we are talking of a PCS 2.0, but this is scaled up many times over. PCS perhaps might become completely outdated because PCS will get fused into this. Just imagine the benefits in terms of efficiencies that you can leverage, cost reductions, because everything is happening on an electronic platform, unified. Everybody is messaging and speaking on one common platform. So there is clarity of understanding. Everybody knows what exactly is going to happen. It's all there in the architecture. So start encouraging and this is where the faculty also needs to, go beyond, no offense meant, to go beyond what has been taught to them or what they think they know of. None of us is the repository of knowledge, but you don't evolve as a human being unless you start learning every day. And unless we have the humility to say that, yes, I know very little in the world, but I keep my eyes and ears open of all the developments that are happening. I'm willing to absorb to the best of my capacity and try and build it in whatever manner I can. Then look at cyber security. This is something which people talk about very loosely, of what happens in terms of cyber security. The single biggest threat going forward, to my mind, is proportionate to the extent of automation that happens in the maritime industry. You will have vulnerabilities from cyber security perspective. You may argue, you may make out a case that, it's not likely to impact me. What the hell? This is in the remote, it's distant. It is for somebody else who. But please remember, today things are moving at such rapid pace, and with this electronization, nobody is immune from these vulnerabilities or these fragilities. It has happened in a few instances to maritime industry, and it is only the beginning. And those of you who are from the armed forces background would hopefully agree with me that the next theater of warfare is not on a physical combat, as generally, in terms of military doctrine, what is being spoken about is that warfare, Ukraine, Russia is a standoff which could be a one-off, but increasingly you will have warfare fought out on the cyber domain. That is where the military's prowess will be tested, whether it's the Navy, the Air Force or the Army. That's where I think the next levels of warfare are going to play out on the cyber domain. And sure enough, we must understand that this is our Achilles heels. How many of us even tell or even are aware that there is an Information Technology Act of the year 2000, one of the most robust pieces of legislation world over in terms of building for cybersecurity architecture? And we are proud that India did pilot that in the year 2000. It has undergone several iterations, and today it's a fairly decent piece of legislation. And it provisions, for example, if you look at the rules framed under this act, you look at the Gazette notifications under these rules, there are clear 25 pages of do's and don'ts prescribed. How do you sanitize yourself? How do you protect yourself from a cyber threat? Not just for government institutions, but even for private institutions. It's a remarkable piece of policy document. Please look at it if you have the time and the stomach for it. The do's and don'ts are prescribed to fine detail. And you don't need to reinvent the wheel. I'm on the board of today of a few companies as an independent director. As part of corporate governance, I tell the companies, I said, you don't need to have an IT consultant. Just look up this document. Tremendous amount of work Government of India has done, and adopt and adapt that document to what you can do in the IT domain. Yeah, beyond that, if you want to have, for sure you can look at that. So let's encourage that. How do you look at cyber security? How many of us have even heard of a body called CERTIN, Computer Emergency Response Team India, CERTIN? It's doing a phenomenal job of trying to issue advisories, sensitization of the potential of cyber threats as they keep emerging. And it is the go-to place that if you have been stuck, if you had a cyber attack, you're down, then that is the place to go to, CERTIN. It's a Government of India body. How many of you are aware that there are certifying authorities which can do cyber security audits for you? So the point I'm trying to make is that there has to be this understanding, this drilling of basic knowledge, small modules, half an hour to 1 hour being taught in the maritime training institutions to try and inculcate some of these necessities which the boys and girls as trainees and cadets are going to face, whether they like it or not, in the future. The world is not cocooned. You can only shelter them for 3 years, 4 years in the maritime training institutions. Then they get down to the real world, right? Real world is absolutely nasty. It might sound very pleasant, but it's absolutely nasty. So you have to confront some of these bumps that will come along the way. And you can't say that, okay, after I've plunged into my first employment, then I will see how it happens. It is better to train them with the basic skill sets as you do this. Then I talked about, I said, insurance, maritime insurance, finance, law. Yeah, there are these one-off institutions which have done yeoman work, Narottam Moraji Institute of Shipping, for example, and then a few other entities, pause very quickly, may have this in some avatar incarnation going forward. Do we provision for that? So what are the hygienes and protocols for that? Let's start teaching our children about this. Crisis and disaster management. Typically, yes, if there is an incident on board, if there's an accident on board, if there's a fire and all of that, yes. But beyond that, for example, when you come on a shore assignment, you're not insulated from disaster. You could be in any place, there could be a flood, there could be a fire and what have you. How many of us tell and even introduce the cadets and trainees to a fact that we have a very robust national disaster management policy, NDMA policy of the year 2005, and which has been sort of reformulated over a period of time, and it has served the time well. There is a National Disaster Management Authority, and similarly corresponding there's a State Disaster Management Authority, which you can tap in and draw in their expertise, and they will be happy to present to you modules and train and say this is the basic do's and don'ts for disaster management that you need to follow. Please remember, when you come off a ship, at the end of the day you will be serving in an office establishment, right, in the maritime industry. What happens if a disaster strikes there? Cyber disaster, for example. How many of you even think that the information, I'll just go back very quickly, the Information Technology Act prescribes that your cyber resources must be at 3 places at least. One within the office premises, one in another location, a secondary location in the same city, and a third in a completely tertiary location outside that city. So that if you have a downtime, you can, for business continuity purposes, you can leverage that and revive within about an hour max. So these are precautions. Risk management frameworks. Risk is intrinsic to business. There is no getting away from that. Risk in one form, one manifestation or the other is intrinsic to business. Let us start introducing risk management frameworks. I'm not advocating that you start teaching them about ISO 31000, which is the global standard for risk management. Or I'm saying basic introduction to risk management, because risk management means risk identification, risk mitigation, and risk containment. So this is something which they need to do, because it is an underlying embedded aspect of managing businesses well. If you're able to manage risks, you can ensure that your business runs proficiently. That is the bottom line. Leadership. I was just mentioning the other day, when there was this 100th birth anniversary of Captain J.C. Anand, just about last week, the Company of Master Mariners of India had organized this function in the MCA ground in BKC, and I had the privilege of attending that in the evening. And when I was invited to speak, I said, amongst other things, you want to have leadership? Just talk about the life of Captain J.C. Anand. You don't need to look beyond. What he has done in his lifetime, I don't think all of us collectively put together in lifetimes could even achieve a fraction of that. Against all odds, against adversities in an environment where the government was not supportive back then, he was an institution builder. He built from scratch the Indian Register of Shipping, got it membership of the International Association of Classification Societies, the IACS, and also was the founder member of the National Association of Shipowners Association of India, the INSA, Indian National Shipowners Association. And would you believe it, in the year when he was 93, when people would have called it a day and said, I'll look after my great grandkids, I'll spend the next few years of my life, in retirement. He had the audacity, the courage of his convictions to come up and say, look, and this was in 2015, and I was absolutely blessed when as DG I was invited as a chief guest to launch the homegrown P&I club for India, Protection and Indemnity Club of India. He pioneered that in 2015 when he was 93 years old, mind you. So you want to look at leadership, and this is something which I am very fond of saying. And I said this in my address. I said, Captain Anand, they don't make folks like you anymore. And this is not just as a sop or a palliative to him. I said, people like that who, to the sheer courage of convictions, will stand up and say the truth and speak truth to power. That is the ability of leadership. Leadership is not just leading men. You can be just planted in a seat. You can be pitchforked and say that, okay, I make you as the MD or the CEO. That is not leadership. Leadership is the ability to motivate, enthuse the rank and file through your stellar competence and integrity, a combination of two. You're not a leader if you don't have these two. And you will not hesitate to encourage others to speak, contribute, and take them along with you. That is true test of leadership. You want businesses to grow, people will be there. There are these IRMs and GIRMs, you'll have corporate world, they will get fat cat bonuses, you will rise to your next level of Peter Drucker's principle of management. You rise to your level of incompetence. At the end of the day, no matter who the hell you are, you will at 40, 50 become MD. That is your level of competence. But beyond that, you don't rise, right? So leadership is transcending that. And that is something you should teach students at a pretty young age. That is what is expected. In a ship, the captain should be able to inspire confidence that come what may, the cadet will give up his life or her life to stand by. That you cannot, because if the captain is not worth his salt, you will not be able to motivate the cadet to do that for you. So this is the quality of leadership that you need to inculcate, because it is so critical to the success, whether it is on board ships or whether it's of any organization. Then piracy, armed robbery. I'll just take 5-10 minutes max, and please bear with me. Piracy and armed robbery. People may assume that in 2009, when piracy first surfaced off the coast of Somalia, and then it got contained from July 2012. I was joined DG that time, and it was a humongous task for us to get back almost 42 Indian seafarers. People assume that everything is hunky-dory, there will be no piracy. We are living in a fool's paradise, for God's sake. The causative factors of piracy still remain. The fact that those states are failed states, whether it is Somalia, whether it's Nigeria, on the west coast of Africa, there is an opportunity cost to that. You must understand that these are very, very dense shipping lanes of those routes. So you can have a piracy attack. I remember 2013, I think, if memory serves me right, there was a film made on piracy, and then there was, an organization, and I don't want to name it here. They said we will do a free screening for different institutions. A lot of people were agitated. No, how can you teach cadets and trainees about piracy? You are alarming them. You are, motivating them to go from. I said, for God's sake, what on earth are you talking about? Piracy and armed robbery are harsh realities of maritime voyages. Whether you like it or not, please inculcate that from the word go. Tell them that this is something you could happen, not to scare you, but prepare yourself well. You cannot say that, if tomorrow you don't tell them and they are, for God's sake, if they are hijacked, then what the hell do you do? So these are scenario building that you must teach them right at the beginning. You cannot turn a blind eye and say that, it's like the cat, when it laps up the milk, it closes an eye, assumes that everything is all right with the world. You can't be stupid like that. International legal sanctions of whether it's the US, OFAC sanctions, Office of Foreign, and all of that, assets control of the United States administration, whether it's the United Nations Security Council, there are sanctions which are imposed. And I don't know how many of you are aware, because I'm on the panel of the UN as a global maritime expert, so I deal with this, and I'm saying it with humility. Sanctions impact, there are a lot of sanctions which are maritime oriented. But what happens when maritime, the UN has authorized global navies by a mandate through a Security Council resolution to intercede and stop, interdict, the technical word is interdict vessels, merchant vessels anywhere in the globe, to enforce UN sanctions. If any navy deems it that the UN sanction has been breached, it is fully authorized by that resolution to board a ship, seize and make the ship desist. All hell then breaks loose for the seafarers. You are impounded, your vessel is impounded, you are stuck in a very hostile environment, you are subject to interrogation, there is collateral damage. So seafarers are getting impacted, mind you. I dealt with two sets of sanctions. One is Joint DG in 2013 when charcoal, which is prohibited for export from Somalia, was carried by 72 Indian MSVs, merchant sailing vessels of Gujarat coast. It took me 1 year of effort to try and get the whole damn thing set right and then send a report to the UN, and finally that was accepted. Then in 2016, I remember the date, even April 29th, there was an Indian merchant ship, I don't want to name it, Indian flag ship, a large ship, which picked up a consignment of 6 lakh barrels of oil from Libya. I don't know how many of you are aware, in Libya there were two governments, parallel governments, one which is recognized by the UN, one which is not recognized. So there are NOCs, national oil companies, which are parallel run by two of these. So this Indian flag ship, which was on a long-term voyage charter, an 18-month charter, was forced to pick up 6 lakh barrels of oil from that NOC, which was not under the government recognized by the UN. So I got a call from the Indian permanent representative in New York one day in the morning at 5 o'clock. He said, Mr. Shetty, I'm Syed Akbaruddin speaking. I just want to mention that I've just come off a UN meeting and this vessel has been listed, sanctioned, Indian merchant ship. Could you please do something, because it's the first time that we are having to deal with this in the UN. I said, okay, I'll deal with it. Then I called up the MD CEO. I don't even want to name anybody for this. This is not intended to shame. I took it upon myself, and believe me or not, I gave an ultimatum. I was DG then at that time. I gave an ultimatum to that the CMD. I said, you shall get that. The vessel was in Malta. I said, you shall get this vessel back in 5 days' time back to Libya. And I have made arrangements for discharge of that entire consignment under UN supervision back. That's the only way I said you can get off the sanction, and also India will be off the hook. Between May 26th, I think 26th is the correct, April 26th and May 6th, we managed to get the entire consignment brought back and offloaded. And believe it or not, on 12th of May, in a flat 16 days time, I was monitoring it almost every 2-3 hours, every day, including a weekend. And in the 16th day, the UN completely desanctioned, delisted India and that vessel. But I just shudder to think what could have happened. The misery of the seafarers could have continued even beyond if he had not stepped in and done damage control quickly. So to the extent that the UN sanctions impact seafarers, this is not known, and I kept telling even then, people blissfully ignore this fact that you can be impacted by a UN sanction. So please try and teach them that there is something like this, there is a political animal called as a UN sanction, for God's sake. Please introduce them to this topic, if nothing else. Then, of course, then we have this gender diversity. This is not to, bring about, sort of mitigate that inclusivity. Socio-cultural integration. Today, most merchant vessels have an average of about 17 to 18 crew members globally, and they are a very heterogeneous group from diverse mix. So you'll have some Ukrainians possibly, you'll have some Russians, Filipinos, Indians, and a whole mix of them. Language is a barrier. Cultural shock, how do you get along with them? So that's a challenge. This is something that maritime training institutions would do well to train, that how do you integrate well, and also how do you address mental health issues. Unfortunately, the number of suicides, it's no laughing matter really. If you look at the sheer statistics of how many people have taken lives on board ships, it's pretty scary to come to think of it. Why do they do that? And this is where also you come to the issue of testing the emotional quotient of a student. It's not enough, when you induct somebody into an MTI purely on the basis of an IQ. You need to evaluate the emotional quotient. Whether that person, you could have psychosomatic tests or whatever means as best as you can possibly. It's not foolproof. How do you evaluate and make sure that the boy or the girl coming in have the right, not just the intellectual caliber, but also the mental makeup to withstand pressures of the highest order, isolation for prolonged periods of time? How do they ensure that? So you need to train. It's not enough to just wish it away and say, no, let me not talk about mental health, because then it scares the boys and girls. That's no good. You're doing disservice by that. Then there is also this requirement, and then people keeps asking, and this is something which has come up in the 6 years that I served, 4 years as joint DG and then 2 years as DG. The general public is not aware of what the maritime industry does for it. We keep spouting the statistics, 95% by volume, 70% by value of global EXIM trade moves on the maritime routes. But if you ask the common man, he or she doesn't know a damn about what the maritime sector is about. That's because there is a sea blindedness. How do you inculcate a sense of sea mindedness gradually? How do you make sure that people get aware of the contributions that seafarers and the merchant shipping industry do across the globe? So this is an input when you need to train. How do you disseminate within your own informed circles, etc., and look at all of that? And finally, I'll just leave this thought of corporate governance. It's, as I said, the average lifespan of an active mariner is about 10 to 15 years, after which, for whatever reason, and they're valid reasons, they come on shore. But after that, when they get into the industry, they will mature either through their own enterprises or joint shipping companies or logistic companies. They will grow there, in the ladder and will assume corporate governance role. That is where corporate governance basics would have to be taught right at the beginning. And I've seen corporate governance at fairly close quarters in the last 4 years as an independent director. And I'm not saying, and I'm saying with the utmost humility, please don't think that I'm trying to blow a trumpet. I have seen horror stories across, and this is true even in the civil service. And 37 years in service has taught me. There are 95% people who will not stand up and speak for whatever it is worth. Because truth is inconvenient, right? So nobody wants to be the bad guy. Everybody wants to be goody-goody and say, okay, let me look at my career. But the fact is that you need to bite the bullet, as the saying goes. You need to tell the truth because you are doing disservice by not telling in a company, for example, if there is an inconvenient thing, you must have the ability to politely say with rationale, with justification, this is not correct. My view, this is what it is, and have it recorded. So corporate governance in the overall scheme. So I think these are some of the strands. I can go on and on. My apologies, I've taken an enormous amount of time, but I can go on and on. But essentially, I will sum it up by saying that it is not enough for you to be a pure play mariner. Gone are the days, and no disrespect meant to the past generation. Yes, because the world was far more closed, insular. Today the world is getting integrated. It's a globalized village. So everything is happening, and the pace of change is so rapid. There is nothing constant. As I keep saying, there is change inevitable, and more importantly, the pace of change is stunning. So unless you brace yourself for that pace of change and start making your students think. So all you need to do is capture some of this and build in, half an hour modules, 1 hour. I'm sure that can be done logically, and say, okay, this is how I prepare him or her to deal with real world situations in a better manner, in a more informed manner. And that means the establishment, the management of the Maritime Training Institution and the faculty must have the humility to appreciate that and build into that framework. And of course, the Director General of Shipping also has a role to play in, if required, mandating them or using moral suasion methods and the like. So I think I've taken far too long. Thank you so much for your patient hearing. It's a delight, and I hope what I said makes sense. And thank you so much to Littoral Communications for the opportunity provided to me. Thank you, and have a good day, and wish you all the very best. Thank you.